But the European Union itself is perceived as the origin of the funding. And indeed, such is reinforced by the imposition of large, star-studded plaques, which must be displayed prominently, with hefty fines being levied in the event of a failure to comply. So it would appear the solidarity which is being built is not so much between the beneficial countries and the donors, like ourselves, but the beneficial countries and the European Union, which is seen as the source of the largesse. So where is the nationality, the solidarity between nations in this situation? Moving on to subsidiarity, this is defined, according to the glossary of the EU website, as the principle whereby the Union does not take action except in the areas which fall within its exclusive competence, unless it is more effective than action taken at national, regional, or local level. Their definition on their website. But the problem we identified above with the hollowing out of the concept of solidarity, wonderful principle though it may be, pales into insignificance in relation to the obfuscation and thorough disingenuousness that exists around subsidiarity. The half-heartedness of the EU's commitment to the principle is evident in the very language that's used. For example, where the Union has exclusive competence, their quote, this is explicitly excluded from challenge by the subsidiarity principle. So if they decide they control it, they control it. End of. But one of the biggest criticisms made against the European project is the ability with which it arrogates competences to itself at the expense of national parliaments, and the anti-democratic nature of such behaviour. Of course, the fact that power was previously exercised at a subsidiary level, but then is arrogated in the centre, is clear evidence of which direction the power is flowing. And maybe you try to remember when is the last time you saw power and decision-making flowing in the other direction as a consequence of the...
20 seconds?
Yeah, of the European Union. So, when we come to understand the crippled state the EU now finds itself in, where it maintains its popularity by identifying and paying homage to the twin pillars of solidarity and subsidiarity, it has hollowed out the one and turned the other on its head. Okay, I should finish this.
Thank you very much, Dr. Douglas. And now for the women's side, who is going first? Mr. Mark Brown.
Good evening, everybody. I'm grateful for the chance to participate in this debate. And I'm grateful to CARP and to Michael Schroeder for taking initiative to make a debate like this, because I feel it's very sorely needed. I'm sorry that there's only 25 people and not 25,000 here. But anyway, we'll make a small drop in the ocean, and it'll be better than nothing. The official Brexit debate so far, I agree with the chairman, or with actually Michael, who said it at the beginning, has been pretty dire on both sides, I fully admit, including on the Remain side. We've had professional politicians with definitely self-interested motivations trying to sell arguments to the public based on a perception of their self-interest and relatively small-minded concerns. And it's hard to be proud of the debate that's been had or the contribution made by either side. The importance of the decision has potentially momentous consequences, not only for the UK, but also for Europe and also for the world. And the electorate should have been given a true perspective on what those consequences are or are likely to be. So, not only a true perspective or a truer perspective, but also higher level values and high principles should have been engaged in the debate so far, but unfortunately they were not. The result is that the electorate is confused, veering one way or the other, not really knowing what to think, and not really, I feel, deeply engaged in the debate. So, having criticised the lack of a true perspective, I want to suggest to you what is a true perspective within which the debate should be conducted. We live in a world which is rushing helter-skelter towards globalisation. I think we all recognise that. It's happening, we need to be aware of it, and We need to understand how to deal with it. At the same time, the problem of humanity has always been one of selfishness, the tendency to look after our own interests, to focus on what's of concern to us, to the exclusion of what is good for the whole or the concern of others. In a globalizing world, we will either overcome selfishness on all levels, the individual, on the level of the society, the nation, and also internationally, or we will perish. It's as simple as that. We are in that situation right now, as a whole human race. It is the only way to survive, is already to become less self-centered and ideally totally non-self-centered. We need as individuals, communities, nations, and on the international level, to cultivate selflessness for all we are worth. If we don't hang together, we will hang separately. That is the realistic state of humanity. Our individual interests should be subordinated to that of the families to that of the communities to that of the nation, and the nations to that of the world. The debate which we've had so far should be held, and the EU should be evaluated in its true historical context. In the beginning, humanity took decisions right at the beginnings of the human race on a very local basis, because that was the whole purview, that's all they knew about, that's all they were connected to. So local decisions were okay at that time. But to encapsulate all of human history in a few words, what we have seen is progressively the development of decision making to be on higher and higher levels. And to take one of the most important recent examples of this development, in the middle of the last century, particularly in the 1860s and 70s, we saw the birth of the nation-state problem. Of course, there were nation-states before that, but the world was not dominated by nation-states. There were a few nation-states, and the rest we're talking about city-states and provinces, counties, kingdoms, whatever you choose to call them. And we saw the advent of Bismarck and the advent of Garibaldi in Italy, and we saw the effect that they had in galvanizing their collection of small city-states, or Germany or the Länder, into a nation-state, which became great nation-states, based on the pooling of the sovereignty, the resources, the solidarity between those smaller entities. And nationalism came into its own from the 1870s until very recently. That was the era when nationalism was a good thing, because it was a higher level thing than what had preceded it. There was more solidarity, more sense of common purpose, more sense of cooperation, and so on and so forth. But, and this is the big but when you come to the EU debate that we're having at the moment, the era of the nation state is now long past. We should not be talking or be so concerned anymore about nation states, because we are headed to a globalized world. And if we're going to be able to govern this globalized world, it follows that inevitably our decision-making processes must move to the world level. It's absolutely logical. If we don't do that, things will be happening on the global level, happening on the internet, happening in the environment, happening in all kinds of other domains, but we won't have the governing structure to be able to control it in the right way. So, the nation states have been a godsend for the last 130, 140 years. But if we continue now to be clinging to nationalism as a force, insisting on the separateness of nations and nations going their own way, rather than going together in concert, this will be not a virtue anymore, but a vice. And this is the stage we've reached in the history of the world. So blocks of nations must be established before any realistic kind of world government can be established. If we don't develop from the individual nations to regional groups of nations that govern together with each other, we will never get to a state where we can govern the world, because the world will ultimately be governed by the agreement between the different regions of the world. That is how I believe it is destined to work, and we have to make it work. what we need to understand about the EU is that the EU is the pioneer organisation of all of these things. It has masses of faults. I think Colin Turfus and Neil O'Neill were actually rather kind to the EU rather than being too harsh. I freely admit, we do on our side, that the EU has multiple faults, more faults than probably any of us in this room know about, because we only hear about the worst ones. But the point is, and the big point which should be central to this debate, is that the EU, with all of its faults and all of its failings, still, because it gets nations to work together with democratic control and a degree of subsidiarity, is something wholly new on a different level and precious for that reason. And the solution to all of its problems is to solve the problems. I don't agree, and I'll go on in my next presentation to explain that it has reformed itself to a degree. It must reform itself much more, and it will reform itself much more. The solution is not to leave, the solution is to stay and reform. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Grant.
If you want to give an extra 30 seconds or whatever it was.
It was 10. It was 10.
The microphone here is not.
Yeah, I turned it on. Yep.
Come on with your one.
30 seconds notice. And now it's Mr. O'Neill.
Thanks, Peter. So hi everyone. I think that as someone who doesn't have grey hair, you may be surprised that I'm sitting on this side of the panel this evening. No offense, Colin. But I think, like many other young people across Europe, there's been an increasing sense of disillusionment, with this vision that Mr. Brand just outlined in his talk. And I think initially, a few years ago, maybe 5 years ago, I subscribed to these ideas that you were just purporting. I think I saw, when I was much more uninformed, I saw the EU as a sort of fuzzy, happy-clappy institution which helped me get through passport controls quicker on the continent, and it wasn't really the sort of thing which I saw as interfering in my daily life or causing any significant problems as it is today. So I think the reason why there is so much disillusion within the UK at the moment and across the continent, and especially with young people, is because the reality of the EU just simply doesn't add up when tested against its ideals. Colin has mentioned various problems which have come about within the continent. We currently see a north-south divide economically, where the countries such as Germany, Netherlands, and the northern Scandinavian countries, they've benefited extraordinarily out of the Eurozone, and it's very much at the detriment of those in Southern Europe. And it really does seem to be the case that instead of bringing about peace and bringing about prosperity, what the EU has actually delivered is a continent where we haven't seen, where there's a divide which we haven't seen on the scale that was around in the Second World War, and also destitution, which hasn't been visited on the continent for a long time. So when addressing this notion, I think that it's very important that we do look out for our country's best interests. I completely disagree with this idea that it's selfish to look out for one's best interests.
Sorry,
The whole is, no, I'll take points of order at the end. I think that this idea that nations should be sacrificed in order to build up a greater whole, which is actually less than the sum of its parts, which the European Union actually is at the moment, is not a very wise idea. It's not a good choice for this country, and it's clearly not a good choice for Europe. And it's actually sowing the seeds of division which it's intended to overcome. So how do we know what's best for our country? Well, none of us in this room can tell the future unless your name is George Osborne or you work for the Treasury. But we can reasonably determine a path which is good for our country based on the risks and the potential opportunities before us in leaving the European Union. So in my view, I think that the best course of action for the UK is to take back control over our ability over key areas of policy, which the EU currently has control over. I believe that also we need to take back control of our democracy. The EU and its institutions are inherently undemocratic. Some argue that they were intended to be that way. And I think for that reason, it cannot deliver good governance. It cannot deliver governance which is accountable to us, the people in Europe. It cannot deliver good democratic governance. And for that reason, I just don't buy the idea that it will provide anything of good value in the long term for this country and the rest of Europe. So it is, and I believe that it's fundamentally impossible when looking at these institutions, and I'll just mention two institutions now, the European Commission, which is a wholly unelected body, and it essentially acts as the government body within Europe at the end. There is an election process in the appointment, but none of the commissioners are directly elected by us, the people, and they can't be held directly accountable.